Evelyn grabbed her sister's travel bag and walked out the door before Rose could finish her sentence. Not because she was brave, because someone had to be. Rose stood at the top of the stairs, tears streaming, hands trembling around a crumpled letter, the letter from the rancher she had promised herself to and now refused to honor. "I can't go," Rose whispered. "I can't marry a stranger." Evelyn picked up the photograph of her sister from the side table, tucked it into the bag, and said nothing. If you're new here, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, then drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The train seat was hard, and the window glass was dirty, and Evelyn Carter had not slept in 36 hours. She sat with her spine straight, her hands folded over the travel bag in her lap, watching the American West unfold outside the smeared window like something that didn't know it was supposed to be beautiful. Red rock and pale grass and sky so enormous it felt like a threat. She had never been this far from home. She had never intended to be. This was not her journey. It had never been meant for her. 3 days ago, she had been sitting at the kitchen table in their small house in Ohio, working through a stack of mending, while Rose read aloud from her latest letter, the one from the rancher in Wyoming. His name was Mason Calloway. He owned land called Red Ridge Ranch outside Laramie. His letters were short and practical, not romantic, and Rose had read them with a kind of delighted disappointment, always hoping the next one would be warmer than the last. "He doesn't know how to talk about feelings," Rose had said, holding the letter at arm's length like she was inspecting fabric. "But he's trying. You can tell he's trying." Evelyn had kept her eyes on the mending. "He's a rancher, Rose. They don't write poetry. They build fences." "I know that." Rose folded the letter carefully. "I'm not asking for poetry. I just want to know if he's kind." "Write back and ask him." "I already did. He didn't answer that part." 3 days later, Rose had stood at the top of the stairs with the travel bag packed and a train ticket bought, and her face gray with a terror she couldn't name. She had agreed to this arrangement 6 months ago, when their father was still alive and the house was still financially sound, and a respectable arrangement with a Western rancher had seemed like security for everyone involved. Now their father was 4 months in the ground, the house was mortgaged. Past comfort, and the morning the train was supposed to leave, Rose had pressed her back against the wall and said very quietly, "I can't do it." Evelyn had looked at her sister for a long moment. Rose was 22. She was soft-hearted and quick to laugh, and she still believed, despite all available evidence, that life would arrange itself into something gentle if you just held on long enough. She was not equipped for Wyoming. She was not equipped for a man who didn't answer the feeling parts of letters. "You gave your word," Evelyn said. "I know." Rose's voice broke. "I know I did. But Evelyn, a stranger, a place I've never seen. What if he's cold? What if the land is terrible and the winters are brutal, and what if there's nothing kind about any of it? Then you learn to manage it." "I can't." Rose pressed both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking. "I'm sorry. I know I'm supposed to be stronger than this. I'm sorry." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The train left in 4 hours. There was a ticket. There was a name on a letter. There was a man standing on a platform somewhere in Wyoming who had made plans based on a promise. She stood up and picked up the bag. "Evelyn," Rose dropped her hands. "What are you doing?" "Correcting the situation." "You can't, you're not me. He's never seen you." Evelyn picked up the photograph from the side table, the one Rose had mailed to Laramie months ago, taken at a portrait studio, Rose in her best dress with her hair done properly. Evelyn stared at it for 1 second, then tucked it into the bag. "He has a photograph, that's all." "You look nothing like me." "I look enough like you that it will take him a moment. And in that moment, I'll tell him the truth." Rose stared at her. "What truth? That your sister refused to come, that she sent her older sister instead, like a replacement part." "That's exactly what I'll tell him." Evelyn latched the bag. "And then he can decide what to do, but he deserves to know someone showed up, someone honored the arrangement, even if it wasn't the right someone." He'll send you home. Probably. Then what was the point? Evelyn looked at her sister one last time. Rose was crying now. Real tears, the kind that came from guilt and relief, tangled together so tightly you couldn't separate them. She was a good person who had made a promise she couldn't keep, and she would feel terrible about it for a long time. And she would also be profoundly grateful that someone had stepped in to absorb the consequence of it. That was the Carter family and two women. Rose felt everything. Evelyn handled everything. The point, Evelyn said, is that someone has to go. The train pulled into Laramie in the late afternoon, the light flat and orange, and the air sharper than anything Evelyn had breathed in her life. She stepped onto the platform with the travel bag in one hand and the bundle of letters in the other. All of Rose's correspondence with Mason Calloway, tied with a piece of twine, which Evelyn had read 3 times on the train, trying to understand who she was walking toward. She knew the facts. Red Ridge Ranch, 12 miles southeast of Laramie. 160 acres of grazing land, more if you counted the leased parcels. A small crew of ranch hands. A cook who had been with the place for 15 years. Mason Calloway, 38 years old, widowed 4 years ago, no children. He had not mentioned his wife's name in any of the letters. He had mentioned her once in the second letter, in a single careful sentence. I have been managing the ranch alone for some time now, and find it practical to establish a proper household arrangement. That was all. No grief, no explanation, just a gap where a person used to be acknowledged only by the word alone. Evelyn stood on the platform while the other passengers dispersed around her, and she looked at the town. The low wooden buildings, the dust, the enormous weight of the open sky, and she understood for the first time, standing in it, rather than reading about it, why Rose had been afraid. This was not a place that made promises. This was a place that kept score. She heard him before she saw him. Not words. Just the sound of boots on the platform boards, deliberate, unhurried the walk of a man who didn't rush because nothing in his world rewarded rushing. She turned. Mason Calloway was taller than she had imagined from the letters. Leaner. He wore a dark coat over work clothes, and his hat was the kind that had been shaped by weather rather than intention. And his face was... She searched for the word and landed on settled. Not handsome in any soft sense. Settled. Like the land itself. Like something that had been tested repeatedly and had not moved. He stopped 6 feet away from her and looked at her the way a man looks when something doesn't match what he was expecting, and he takes a moment to determine whether the error is his eyes or the situation. His eyes moved to the photograph in his hand. He'd brought it, the one Rose had sent, holding it at his side, and then back to her face. "You're not her," he said. 3 words. Not a question. Not an accusation. Just a statement delivered with the same flatness as the land around them. Evelyn had prepared for this moment on the train. She had rehearsed 3 different versions of what she might say. All 3 of them left her head the instant he spoke, and what came out instead was the plain truth with no decoration at all. "No," she said. "I'm not. I'm Evelyn Carter. Rose is my younger sister. She stopped. Tried again. "She wasn't able to make the journey. I came in her place to explain the situation to you directly and to apologize on behalf of my family for the disruption to your plans." Mason looked at her for a long moment. She could not read his expression, and she was not a woman who frightened easily, but she felt the weight of that look in a way she hadn't anticipated. He wasn't angry. That would have been easier to manage. He was simply measuring something. "Wasn't able," he said. "Or wouldn't." Evelyn held his gaze. Wouldn't. She was frightened. She made a decision she shouldn't have made when she agreed to the arrangement, and she understood too late that she couldn't honor it. "So she sent you." "I volunteered." "Why?" It was such a direct question that it almost knocked her sideways. She hadn't expected him to ask why. She'd expected anger or cold formality or dismissal. Not a single honest question delivered like he actually wanted to know the answer. "Because someone had to come," she said. "You made plans based on a commitment from our family. You deserve an explanation from a person, not a letter." Mason looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked at the platform around her, the single trunk, the travel bag, the bundle of letters. "You brought the letters back." "They're yours. You wrote them." She wrote back. "She did. I brought those too." Evelyn held out the bundle. "I thought you should have the complete correspondence." He didn't take it. He looked at it, and then at her face, and then he turned slightly and looked out at the street beyond the platform, where a wagon and 2 horses were tied to a post. He was quiet for long enough that Evelyn began calculating the next train back east and whether she had enough money in the bag for a ticket. Then he said, "You have anywhere to go from here?" She paused. "Not immediately." "You have resources funds for a return trip?" "Enough." "But not comfortably." She didn't answer that. He already knew the answer. He turned back to her and looked at her with that measuring expression again, and then he said something she was not prepared for. "I'll make you an offer. 1 month." Evelyn blinked. "I'm sorry. 1 month. You work the ranch. Housekeeper, cook's assistant, whatever needs doing. You're fed and housed and paid a reasonable wage for the work. At the end of the month, you go home with money in your pocket, and we call it settled." She stared at him. "You want me to work for you? I want someone who can function in that environment. Rose," he said the name without any visible feeling. "Rose wrote in her letters about flowers and sunsets. That tells me something about what she was looking for. You came 2,000 miles to deliver bad news in person rather than send a letter." He paused. "That tells me something different. I'm not what you planned for. No, but plans change." He picked up her trunk from the platform as though it weighed nothing. 1 month. You decide before then if it's not working, and you leave. I decide before then, and I pay you for the time served, and put you on the train myself. No obligation. No contract. He glanced back at her over his shoulder. "You're practical. You'll understand that arrangement." Evelyn stood on the platform holding the bundle of letters and watching a man she had known for 6 minutes carry her trunk toward his wagon, and she thought about Rose crying at the top of the stairs, and the mortgage on the house, and the empty train platform behind her. She followed him. Red Ridge Ranch was 12 miles of silence. Mason drove the wagon and said nothing, and Evelyn sat beside him and said nothing, and the land opened up around them in a way that was genuinely disorienting. She had grown up in a town where you could see the neighbor's house from your front window, and here there was nothing between her and the horizon in any direction except grass and stone and the occasional dark line of a creek cutting through the distance. It should have felt empty. It felt instead like something that was very full of itself. Like the land had an opinion about being here and didn't particularly need yours. When the ranch buildings came into view, the main house, the barn, the bunkhouse where the hands slept, the small outbuildings she couldn't identify yet. Evelyn made herself look at them practically rather than emotionally. Stone foundation on the main house. Good. That meant it would hold against weather. The barn needed work on the south-facing wall, where the boards had warped, but the structure was sound. The fencing she could see from the approach was maintained not perfect, but maintained, which meant someone out here cared about the work, even when no one was watching. She was cataloging these things because it kept her from thinking about what she had actually done. She had walked onto a train platform to correct her sister's mistake, and ended up agreeing to spend a month in Wyoming working for a stranger. Rose would say this was exactly the kind of thing that happened when you were too practical and not careful enough about where practicality could take you. Evelyn thought Rose had no standing to offer that criticism at this particular moment. Mason stopped the wagon near the main house, and a woman came out of the door, short, solid, with sharp dark eyes and gray-streaked hair pulled back in a no-nonsense knot. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at Evelyn with the kind of frank assessment that Evelyn immediately respected. "This isn't Rose Carter," the woman said. "No," Mason said. "This is Evelyn, Rose's sister. She'll be staying a month." The woman. Mae Dawson Evelyn would learn, who had been cooking for Red Ridge Ranch for 15 years and knew more about its rhythms than Mason did, looked at Evelyn with those sharp eyes for a long moment. "Can you cook?" she asked. "Yes." Can you get up before sunrise? I've been doing it my whole life. Can you follow direction from a woman who's been running this kitchen longer than you've been making your own decisions? Evelyn looked at her steadily. I learn quickly, and I don't argue about things I don't understand yet. May's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted like a door that had been almost closed opening just slightly. Put her in the east room, May said to Mason, and tell me you remembered to bring coffee from town. Bag in the back of the wagon. May turned and went back inside, and Evelyn looked at Mason, and Mason looked at her, and neither of them said anything. He carried her trunk to the east room. It was small, barely enough space for the bed, a washstand, and a chair, but it had a window that faced the morning and the mattress. When Evelyn pressed her hand against it, was real and solid, and not the kind of cruelty a person inflicted deliberately. Mason set the trunk down and straightened up, and looked at her in the small room, and the space between them felt suddenly more present than it had on the open platform. Breakfast is before sunrise, he said. May will show you the kitchen tonight. Hands eat first, you eat after. And you? He paused, like the question was unexpected. Same as the hands. All right. He moved toward the door, and she spoke before she'd fully decided to. Mr. Calloway. He stopped. Thank you, she said, for not putting me back on the train immediately. He looked at her for a moment. His expression didn't soften exactly, but something shifted in it, a slight recognition. Maybe that they were two people in an unusual situation doing their best to be reasonable about it. Don't thank me yet, he said. You haven't seen what needs doing. He left. The door didn't slam. It closed firmly with decision, which she was already understanding was how Mason Calloway did most things. May showed her the kitchen that evening, moving through it with the authority of someone who had organized a space over years until it responded to her like a living thing. She showed Evelyn where everything was kept, what got used daily, what got saved, what the hands expected, and what she absolutely would not be providing them, regardless of what they thought they deserved. Mason doesn't say much, May said, not looking at her, turning out a lamp. I noticed. But he watches. He always watches. She finally looked at Evelyn, those sharp dark eyes level and direct. He had a wife, Clara. She died of a fever 4 years ago. The winter after that he barely spoke to anyone for 3 months. Evelyn kept her expression neutral. He mentioned in his letters that he had been managing alone. That's Mason's way of saying he's been bleeding quietly and hasn't told anyone. May pulled her apron off and hung it on its hook. I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for him. I'm telling you so you understand that what you're looking at when you look at him isn't coldness. It's scar tissue. She paused. A person can mistake one for the other and make a whole set of wrong decisions based on that mistake. Evelyn thought about that. Why are you telling me this? You don't know me. No, May said. But I know the kind of woman who gets on a train to fix something rather than write a letter about it. She moved toward the back door. That kind of woman needs to understand what she's actually working with before she makes up her mind about anything. She went out. The kitchen settled into its nighttime quiet. Evelyn stood alone in the darkness that smelled like wood smoke and coffee grounds, and years of hard work, and she thought, I am in Wyoming. I agreed to 1 month. And the man who lives in this house is not what I expected, and neither is this place, and neither possibly is this situation. She had come to correct a mistake. She was beginning to understand that the situation was more complicated than a correction. The first week was physical in a way that went beyond tiredness into something that remade her sense of what her body could do. She was up before the sky. She worked alongside May in the kitchen, learning the rhythm of a ranch morning, the sheer volume of food required to fuel men who worked that kind of land. The timing that had to be precise because men waiting for breakfast were men standing still when the cattle needed moving. She learned the ranch hands' names. Hector, broad-shouldered and quiet, who had been with Mason for 8 years. Tom Younger, who talked too much and worked hard enough to earn the right to. Old Pete, who said almost nothing and seemed to operate on a kind of internal logic entirely independent of the rest of the world. She managed the ledgers, which nobody had properly organized in months. She found 3 billing errors in the supply accounts that had been silently draining money from the operating fund. She noted them in the margin, corrected the figures, and left the ledger open on Mason's desk. The morning after she did that, she found him standing at the kitchen doorway, watching her work without saying anything. "The ledger errors?" she said, not looking up from the bread dough she was working. "I can explain how I found them if you'd like." "How long had they been there?" "The oldest one is from 8 months ago, approximately $90 total across the 3. Silence. "Did you train for bookkeeping?" he asked. "My father taught me. He said the only person you could trust with accounts was someone who understood what the money was actually for." She looked up. "I understand what this money is for." Mason looked at her for a moment. He wasn't a man who said thank you easily. She was already understanding that. But he gave a single nod and turned and walked out. And that afternoon she found a small increase in the weekly wage he had promised her added without announcement or explanation to the envelope May handed her on Friday. She said nothing about it. She kept working. The first real moment came on a Thursday, 8 days in. She was carrying water from the pump to the kitchen when she heard raised voices near the barn. Not the usual sounds of ranch work. Something sharper, something that had the quality of a confrontation rather than an argument. She set down the bucket and walked toward it. 2 men were standing in the open space before the barn doors. One was Tom, the younger hand. The other was a man she didn't recognize, well dressed for out here, which meant he was from somewhere that thought money was a protection against weather. He had the face of someone who had come to collect something. "The deed's been reviewed," the man was saying, and his voice had that particular smooth confidence of someone who had practiced a speech. "There's a question of the eastern boundary claim that needs resolution before any further—" "Who are you?" Evelyn asked. Both men turned. The well-dressed man looked at her with the patronizing half-smile that certain men brought out automatically when an unknown woman appeared where they hadn't expected one. "And you would be?" "Someone who is asking who you are and why you're speaking to ranch hands about deed claims rather than to the owner of the property." She looked at Tom. "Where's Mr. Calloway?" "South pasture." Tom said, his relief visible. "Go get him." She looked back at the man. "You'll wait." The man's half-smile adjusted to something less certain. "I'm not sure I'm obligated to—" "You're standing on Red Ridge property," Evelyn said. "The obligated party right now is you." She heard Mason's boots on the ground behind her before she heard him speak. She didn't know how something in the change of weight in the air maybe, or the way Tom had started moving faster. "Harlan Webb," Mason said, coming to stand beside her, not in front of her, beside her. She noticed that. "You're off your territory." "Mason." The man's voice adjusted again, oilier now. "Just a friendly visit. I was passing through and thought I'd stop into—" "You're 12 miles off the main road, Harlan. That's not passing through. That's a specific choice." Mason's voice was flat. "Evelyn." She turned slightly. "Go back to the house." She looked at him. He was watching Webb, not her. His jaw was set in a way that was different from his usual flatness. This was something with heat underneath it, something old and contained. "I'm fine here," she said quietly. He glanced at her then, a quick look assessing. Then he looked back at Webb. "We'll have this conversation another time, Harlan. Not on my land, without notice." Webb smiled a different smile, more calculating. "Of course. My apologies for the inconvenience." He glanced at Evelyn. "And a pleasure to meet the lady of the house." "She's the housekeeper," Mason said. Flat, no hesitation. Webb nodded, tipped his hat, and walked back to where his horse was tied. When he was out of earshot, Evelyn said, "What does he want?" "He wants the eastern acres." Mason turned back toward the barn. "He's been trying different approaches for 2 years. Is there a legitimate question about the eastern boundary?" He stopped walking. "The deed," she said. "He mentioned a deed review. Is there a question?" Mason turned to look at her. Something in his expression had shifted, not quite surprise, but the recognition of someone who had been asked a question by someone who actually understood its weight. "There's a question he manufactured," Mason said carefully. "A filing error from 15 years ago that he paid someone to find. Can it be corrected?" "That's what the lawyers say, but lawyers cost money and take time, and Webb is patient." Evelyn thought about the ledgers. About the $90 that had been quietly leaving the account for 8 months. About what other small pressures might be slowly accumulating against this ranch, while the man running it was focused on keeping cattle alive. "Show me the deed when you have time," she said. "You're a housekeeper." "I'm a housekeeper who found 3 billing errors in 8 days. She met his eyes. "Show me the deed." He looked at her for a long moment. The late afternoon light was hard and flat, and his face was unreadable, and he stood with that particular stillness of his that she was beginning to understand was not indifference, but a kind of held breath. A man who moved very carefully because he had learned that careless movement cost too much. "After supper," he said, and walked away. That night at the kitchen table, while May pointedly found reasons to be in every other room of the house, Mason spread the land deed across the table, and Evelyn read it. She read it twice. Then she read the accompanying survey document that Mason produced from a locked box. Then she sat back and thought about what she was looking at. "The error is in the survey notation from 1871, she said. "The boundary marker description. It references a creek junction that no longer exists because the creek shifted after the flood of 1873. Mason looked at her. "That's what the lawyers said." "What's the corrective process?" "File an amended survey with the Territorial Land Office, but it requires a licensed surveyor's verification, and Webb has influence with the Land Office." Mason's jaw tightened. "He has friends there, yes." Evelyn looked at the document again. "There will be original correspondence, from when the deed was originally filed. Letters between your grandfather and the Land Office. I assume this land came through your family. My grandfather filed the original claim in 1868. Then there may be a paper record that establishes the intended boundary independent of the survey notation. If the creek junction is referenced in correspondence prior to the 1871 survey that establishes the original intent." She looked up. "Do you have those letters?" Mason was very still. "Mason." "My grandfather kept everything," he said slowly. "There are boxes in the storage loft above the barn. I haven't—" He stopped. "When did he pass?" 12 years ago. And no one has looked through the boxes. There was never a reason to look." Evelyn closed the deed document carefully and said, "There's a reason now." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, and something passed across his face that she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude, not surprise, but something that sat between them like a recognition that neither of them had been expecting. "You came here to apologize for your sister," he said, quietly, almost to himself. "That was the plan, yes? And now you're in my kitchen at 9 o'clock at night reading a land deed." The kitchen was available. The corner of his mouth shifted. It wasn't a smile. She wasn't sure his face fully knew how to do that yet, but it was the suggestion of one. The idea that a smile was a thing that existed somewhere in his vicinity. "I'll get a lamp," he said. "The loft is dark. It's 9 o'clock. And the boxes won't look for themselves." He stood and went for his coat, and Evelyn looked at the deed still spread across the table and thought, 1 month. That was the agreement. 1 month. She looked at the lamp burning in the center of the table. She looked at the window where the Wyoming darkness was total and enormous and pressing against the glass like it wanted to come inside. She thought, "I came to correct a mistake." And then she got up and followed him to the barn. The loft above the barn smelled like decades, like old wood and leather, and the particular dust that only accumulated when things had been left alone long enough to forget they were waiting. Mason went up first with the lamp. Evelyn followed her skirt, catching once on the ladder rungs, and she freed it without comment and kept climbing. The loft was crowded with the accumulated weight of 3 generations saddle gear that hadn't been used in years. A broken rocker with its back spindles missing crates of tools she couldn't name, and against the far wall, 4 wooden boxes stacked too high, each one sealed with a leather strap. Mason held the lamp and looked at the boxes, the way a person looks at something they have been avoiding, without fully admitting they were avoiding it. "Your grandfather's?" she asked. "Everything he kept. Letters, survey papers, receipts going back to the original claim filing." He paused. "I moved them up here after he died. I told myself I'd go through them eventually. 12 years is a long eventually." He looked at her. Not offended, she had the impression Mason Calloway was not easily offended. More like he recognized the accuracy of the statement and had no argument against it. "Start with the oldest box," she said. "The original claim correspondence would be from 67 or 68 before the survey." He set the lamp on a flat crate and pulled the first box down. The leather strap resisted 12 years of Wyoming dry and cold, had stiffened it, and then came loose. He lifted the lid. Letters. Dozens of them. Folded and refolded, some with the Territorial Land Office seal still visible at the top, some written in a hand so cramped it would take time to read properly. Evelyn knelt beside the box and began sorting. She worked the way she worked everything methodically, without wasted motion, creating a rough chronological order from the postmarks on the envelopes. Mason knelt on the other side of the box and watched her for a moment, then began doing the same on his section without being asked. That was the first thing she noticed. He didn't stand back and observe while she worked. He picked up the method and matched it. No discussion required. They worked in silence for a while. Not the uncomfortable silence of 2 people who had nothing to say. The working silence of 2 people who were focused on the same thing and didn't need to announce that fact. "Here," she said. He looked up. She was holding a letter unfolded carefully, dated March 1867. The handwriting was different from the survey documents, older, more deliberate, the penmanship of a man who had learned to write when letters were still considered an art rather than a convenience. She read aloud. "The eastern boundary of the claim is established at the junction of the 2 creek channels where the cottonwoods stand, marks the high ground above the floodplain. This is understood by all parties to be the permanent marker, regardless of seasonal water variation." She looked up. "Regardless of seasonal water variation." Mason was very still. "That's your grandfather establishing the intent of the boundary before the survey ever happened," she said. "Before the 1871 notation that Webb is using. The creek shift doesn't matter if the original intent is documented as independent of the water line. That's a 15-year-old letter. It's a 15-year-old letter with the Territorial Land Office seal on it, addressed to the original claims officer, and it predates the survey notation by 4 years." She set it carefully on the flat crate beside the lamp. "This is what your lawyers need." Mason reached out and picked up the letter. He read it himself, not because he doubted her she understood, but because some things you needed to read with your own eyes before they became real. He read it slowly, and she watched his face in the lamplight, and she saw the moment it landed. His jaw shifted. Something in his shoulders changed. "He knew," Mason said quietly. "He wrote this specifically. He knew there might be a question later, and he put it in writing first. Your grandfather understood that land was only as secure as its paperwork." He set the letter down. "I should have looked through these years ago. You were managing a ranch alone. That's not a reason. That's an excuse." She didn't argue with him. He was right, and he knew it, and he didn't need her to soften it for him. She was beginning to understand that about Mason Calloway, he didn't want things softened. He wanted them accurate. "Are there more?" she asked. He looked back at the box. "Only one way to find out. They were there for 2 hours. By the time they climbed back down from the loft, they had found 3 letters, all predating the disputed survey, all referencing the eastern boundary, in terms that established the cottonwood and high ground marker as the agreed point regardless of water movement. They also found the original claim approval document that the lawyers had told Mason no longer existed. It existed. It had been in a wooden box in a barn loft for 12 years. May was still in the kitchen when they came back in. She looked at the documents in Evelyn's hands and then at Mason's face, and said nothing, just set 2 cups of coffee on the table and went back to the stove without comment. Mason spread the documents beside the deed and looked at them together for a long moment. "I need to get these to the lawyers in town," he said. "Tomorrow morning," Evelyn said. "Carefully. Have them copied before they go anywhere official. Those originals can't be replaced." He looked at her. "You've done this before." "My father had a property dispute with our neighbor when I was 19. It went on for 3 years. I watched every step of it." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "We won." "How?" "Paper," she said. "My father kept everything. Every letter, every survey note, every conversation he put in, writing himself. In the end, it didn't matter what our neighbor claimed, the paper said something different, and the paper was older." Mason was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father sounds like my grandfather." "Probably." She looked at the original claim document. Men who built something from nothing tend to understand that what you build has to be defended as carefully as it's constructed. Mason picked up his coffee. He didn't drink it immediately. He held it and looked at the papers, and then at the lamp, and then briefly at her. "Why did you offer?" he said. "Tonight, looking through the boxes. You didn't have to do that. You need those eastern acres." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. The kitchen was quiet, and the Wyoming night was pressing against the windows, and the lamp made the space feel smaller and warmer than it was during the day. "Because it mattered," she said, "and I could help, and those seem like sufficient reasons." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and drank his coffee, and neither of them said anything else about it. The lawyers in town received the documents the next morning with a reaction that told Evelyn they had not expected this. The senior partner, a careful man named Aldrich, who wore his suits 2 seasons too formal for a Wyoming frontier town, read the 1867 letter twice and set it down on his desk, and looked at Mason with an expression that combined professional satisfaction with a slight embarrassment that he hadn't thought to ask about existing correspondence years earlier. "This changes the situation significantly," Aldrich said. "I need to know if it's enough to close the claim permanently," Mason said. "Not enough to delay Webb, enough to end it. Combined with the original approval document, yes. I believe we can file an amended boundary declaration that references these as establishing documentation. Webb would need to challenge the Territorial Land Office's own historical record, which is—" Aldrich paused, choosing his words. "Which is a considerably more difficult position for him than the one he currently occupies." "How long?" 4 to 6 weeks for the filing and response period." "And in the meantime, Mr. Webb cannot take any legal action that would affect the eastern boundary without first responding to the filing we'll submit this week." Aldrich looked at the 1867 letter again. "Where did you find these?" "My barn," Mason said. He didn't look at Evelyn, but she saw the slight tightening at the corner of his jaw that she was starting to recognize as the thing he did when he felt something he hadn't decided yet whether to show. "Your barn," Aldrich repeated in the tone of a man who was going to have a word with himself about thoroughness. On the street outside the lawyer's office, Mason stood for a moment in the sharp morning air and looked at nothing in particular. Evelyn waited. "He's not going to stop," he said. "Even when the filing goes through. Webb doesn't stop, he just changes approaches." "I know." He looked at her. "You know, men like Webb don't want one piece of land. They want dominance over a territory. The eastern acres are a starting point, not the goal." She looked down the main street of Laramie, the commerce, the foot traffic, the visible signs of a town that was still deciding what it was going to become. "He'll find another angle." "What angle?" "I don't know yet, but he'll show his hand eventually." She turned back to Mason. "When he does make sure you have paper." He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her the way he had in the barn loft in the lamplight with that measuring attention of his. except it felt different now. Less like he was assessing whether she was competent, and more like he was trying to understand something that kept being more complicated than he expected. "The 1-month arrangement," he said. She went still. "We should talk about it." She kept her expression level. "The month isn't up." "No, but you found a 15-year-old letter that may resolve a legal problem I've been fighting for 2 years. He paused. "That's worth more than the wages I offered." "I wasn't doing it for the wages." "I know you weren't." He met her eyes. "Which is why I want to renegotiate the terms." Her heart did something she wasn't going to give it credit for. She kept her voice even. "What terms?" "Stay past the month," he said. "Not as a trial, not as a housekeeper, as someone who—" He stopped, looked away briefly in the direction of the mountains on the horizon. She understood watching him that this was not a man who was practiced at asking for things. He had spent 4 years engineering his life so that he didn't have to ask for anything. "As someone who has a stake in the ranch," he said finally. "Financial stake, partnership arrangement." Evelyn looked at him. "You're offering me a business partnership." "I'm offering you a reason to stay that isn't charity and isn't wages." He looked back at her. "You understand this land now. You understand the work. You understand the legal exposure." He paused again. "And you're not afraid of it." "I've only been here 9 days." "I know." "You don't know me. I know you got on a train to deliver bad news in person because you thought it was the right thing to do," he said. "I know you found 3 billing errors in 8 days that no one else caught. I know you read a 15-year-old deed dispute in a barn at 10 o'clock at night and understood it." His voice was flat and direct, and she understood that this was how Mason Calloway said things that mattered by stripping all decoration away and leaving just the fact of it. "That tells me something about who you are." Evelyn stood on the Laramie Street and felt the weight of what he was offering settle around her shoulders. It was not romance. It was not the kind of offer a woman read about in the letters Rose had cherished. It was practical and clear-eyed, and it looked at her as a capable person, rather than a situation to be managed, and she found to her own slight alarm that she valued that more than she would have expected. "I'll think about it," she said. "Fair. And Mr. Calloway?" "Mason." She paused. That was the first time he'd said it that way. Not permission exactly. More like a correction of something that had stopped being accurate. "Mason," she said. "If I stay, it's as an equal partner in decisions. Not an advisor. Not someone you consult after you've already decided." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's the only way it would work," he said. They drove back to Red Ridge Ranch, and neither of them said anything else about it, but the silence on the return trip felt different from the one on the way into town. Less like 2 strangers being careful with each other. More like 2 people who had just agreed to something they were still learning the edges of. The problem arrived 4 days later in the form of a visitor who hadn't been invited. Evelyn was at the kitchen table with the household accounts when she heard the horse in the yard. May was at the stove and didn't look up. She had the particular composure of someone who had learned that ranch life brought people to the door at all hours, and most of them could wait for whatever they needed. Evelyn went to the window. The woman who dismounted in the yard was about 40, well dressed in the manner of someone who had money, but had also worked hard enough to know what work looked like. She had the kind of face that had been beautiful once, and was now something better interesting with history in it and authority in the set of her jaw. She knocked on the door without hesitation. Evelyn opened it. "I'm looking for Mason Calloway," the woman said. Then she looked at Evelyn with careful, unreadable eyes. "You must be the sister." "The sister," Evelyn repeated. "Rose Carter, the woman Mason was expecting." The woman's gaze moved over Evelyn's face with the kind of attention that suggested she was very good at noticing discrepancies. "Although you don't match the photograph he showed me." Evelyn had the sudden cold awareness of being seen clearly by someone who was not going to be managed with partial information. "I'm Evelyn Carter," she said, "Rose's sister, and you are Catherine Webb," the woman said, "Harlan's wife." The name landed in Evelyn's chest like a stone dropped into cold water. She kept her face still. "Mr. Calloway is in the south pasture," Evelyn said. "If you'd like to wait." "I'd rather speak with you," Catherine said. "If you'll allow it." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. This woman had ridden out to Red Ridge Ranch knowing her husband was in a legal dispute with the man who owned it. She had done it while Mason was away from the house. And she was looking at Evelyn with an expression that was not hostile. It was something closer to urgency. Evelyn stepped back from the door. Catherine Webb came inside and sat at the kitchen table, not because Evelyn had directed her there, but because she moved to it with purpose, like someone who had already decided where this conversation was going to happen. May turned from the stove, looked at Catherine, and then at Evelyn, and then went very deliberately to the far end of the kitchen and began doing something extremely thorough and time-consuming with a pot that didn't need that much attention. "My husband is going to move against this ranch next week," Catherine said. She kept her voice low and even, as though she was reporting weather. "Not the boundary claim that's been filed, and Harlan knows it's going to hold. Something else." Evelyn sat across from her. "What?" "There's a man in Laramie, a territorial inspector, who has the authority to flag properties for environmental hazard assessment. It's a legitimate process normally used for mining operations that are contaminating water sources." Catherine looked at her hands for a moment, then back up. "Harlan has arranged for this inspector to flag Red Ridge Ranch on the basis of alleged cattle waste contaminating the creek that runs through the eastern parcel." "That's false." "Yes. You know it's false and you're telling me. I know it's false because I know this land and I know what contamination actually looks like, and the creek on the eastern parcel is clean." Catherine's voice stayed even, but something moved behind her eyes. "And I'm telling you because an environmental flag would freeze the property from any legal transfer or financing for up to a year while the assessment is conducted. It would also give Harlan grounds to request an emergency boundary adjustment while the property is under review." Evelyn sat very still. She was calculating the ranch's operating reserves, the legal costs already in motion. What a year-long freeze would do to Mason's ability to hold the herd through winter. "Why?" she said. "Why are you telling us?" Catherine looked at her steadily. "Because Harlan has been doing this for 8 years, to 5 different ranchers in this territory. And I have watched 5 families lose land that was rightfully theirs because they didn't know what was coming until it was too late." Her jaw tightened. "I will not watch a 6th. You're going against your husband." "I'm going against what my husband is doing." The distinction was small and fierce and clearly important to her. "Those are different things." Evelyn thought about Rose standing at the top of the stairs, choosing herself over a commitment she couldn't keep. She thought about Mason, 12 years of boxes in a barn loft, avoiding something he should have faced because it hurt too much to look at. She thought about what it cost a woman to come to a rival's ranch and hand them a weapon to use against her own husband. "The inspector," she said. "When is he scheduled?" "Thursday. He'll present the flag at the county office and request immediate review." "That's 4 days." "Yes." "What stops the flag from being submitted?" "Competing testimony." If the Territorial Water Authority can conduct their own assessment before Thursday and submit a clean finding, the inspector's flag has to go through a secondary review process that takes months, by which time Harlan's arrangement with the inspector will have— Catherine paused. "Will likely have become uncomfortable to maintain." "How do we get the Water Authority out here before Thursday?" "That," Catherine said, "requires knowing someone with the authority to request emergency assessment." She reached into her coat and placed a small card on the table. It had a name on it. "Thomas Reardon," Evelyn read. "Territorial Water Authority District 3. "He's an honest man," Catherine said. "Which is why Harlan doesn't use him." She stood. "If you send a request directly from the ranch signed by the property owner with documentation of the clean water condition, he will come." She buttoned her coat. "Mrs. Webb," Evelyn said. Catherine stopped. "This is a significant risk for you." Catherine looked at her with those careful, intelligent eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "It is." She moved toward the door. Tell Mason Calloway that he needs to get those cattle away from the Eastern Creek for the next 5 days regardless. Even a clean water test looks better without cattle standing in it." She walked out. The yard went quiet. Evelyn sat at the table with Thomas Reardon's card in her hand and listened to Catherine Webb's horse move away across the hardpack, and she thought about what it meant that the wife of the man trying to take this ranch had just handed them the way to stop him. She thought about what that woman's life must look like from the inside. What it cost to be that clear-eyed and still stay. What it cost to come here today. She got up and went to find Mason. She found him at the east fence line checking the post repairs Tom and Hector had done that morning. He turned when he heard her coming and read her face before she said a single word. What happened? She told him everything. Straight through, no pauses for his reaction, giving him the full shape of it before he could start responding to pieces. He stood and listened with that stillness of his, and she watched him take it in, and she saw the exact moment his expression shifted from attention to something harder and colder. "Webb," he said. It came out very quiet. The quiet of something controlled tightly. The environmental flag is the mechanism. The inspector is the tool. The water authority assessment is the counter. She held out the card. 4 days. He looked at the card. He didn't take it immediately. "Catherine Webb came to my house," he said slowly. "Yes." "To warn us." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, processing something she couldn't quite read. "She's been watching him do this for years." That's what she said. "And she's still—" He stopped. "She's still his wife," Evelyn said. "Yes. People's situations are complicated, Mason." He looked at her. Something in the word, the way she'd said his name natural now without the formality of the first week, moved across his expression. "You believe her?" "I do." "Why?" "Because a woman who was lying to help her husband wouldn't have told us how to beat him." Evelyn kept her eyes on his. "She told us what to do and who to call and how to do it. That's not a trap. That's someone who's been keeping something to herself for a very long time and finally couldn't anymore." Mason took the card. He looked at it for a moment. "I need to move the eastern cattle today." "I know. She said 5 days minimum. And someone needs to draft the request letter to Reardon." "I can do that tonight." He looked up from the card. "You'd do it tonight." "The letter needs to go out tomorrow morning at the latest." "So, yes." He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she had started seeing more frequently in the past few days. The one that wasn't quite the measuring look of the first day, but was something that had grown from it, something that had moved past assessment into something else she didn't have a clean name for. "Evelyn," he said. She waited. "When I made the 1-month offer at the station—" He stopped, started again. "I wasn't trying to use you. I want to be clear about that. I saw someone capable of functioning in a hard place, and I made a practical calculation." "I know. But what you've done this past week—" He stopped again. He was not a man who found it easy to say certain things. She could see him working at it, trying to find the words that were accurate without being more than he could stand to give yet. "It isn't what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who would manage the kitchen and stay out of the rest of it." "I don't know how to stay out of things that need doing." "No." He looked at her with something that was almost a question. "I've noticed." The wind came across the pasture and moved between them, and somewhere behind her she could hear the cattle and the fence post that Tom had been working on that morning, and the ordinary sounds of a working ranch going about its afternoon. "Write the letter," he said. "I'll move the cattle." He turned back toward the pasture. 3 steps away he stopped without turning around. "Thank you," he said, quietly, like the words cost him something and he was paying anyway. Evelyn stood at the edge of the fence line and watched him walk away and understood for the first time that she had stopped counting the days of the month. She went back to the house. She sat at the kitchen table. She pulled a clean sheet of paper from the ledger stack and uncapped the ink and began to write the letter that might save Red Ridge Ranch. May set a cup of coffee at her elbow without saying anything. But when Evelyn glanced up, the older woman was watching her with those sharp, dark eyes, and in them was something that looked a great deal like the answer to a question May had been sitting with since the day Evelyn stepped off the train. Evelyn looked back at the letter. She wrote until midnight. She made it precise and thorough, and she referenced the clean condition of the Eastern Creek in terms that would be easy for Thomas Reardon to verify and difficult for a compromised inspector to argue against. When she finished, she read it through once. Then she folded it, sealed it, and wrote Reardon's name and district office address on the front. She set it on the table, where Mason would find it in the morning. Then she went to bed and lay in the East Room, with the Wyoming dark pressing against her window, thinking about Catherine Webb riding home tonight and what waited for her there. Thinking about what it meant to be brave in a direction nobody would ever see. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind had picked up again, restless searching, moving over the land, like it was looking for somewhere to finally settle. Thomas Reardon arrived on Wednesday morning, one day earlier than Evelyn had dared hope. He was a compact, no-nonsense man in his 50s who climbed down from his horse, shook Mason's hand once, and then looked at Evelyn with the direct attention of someone who had read her letter carefully and formed an opinion about the person who wrote it. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Reardon, thank you for coming quickly. Your letter was specific and well documented." He pulled it from his coat pocket. Her letter with notations in the margins that he'd made himself. "I've seen a lot of request letters in 20 years with the Water Authority. Most of them tell me what people want me to find. Yours told me where to look and why." He folded it and put it back. "That's different." Mason looked at her briefly. She didn't look back. Reardon spent 3 hours at the Eastern Creek. He worked methodically, taking samples at 5 different points along the waterline, measuring flow rates, examining the soil condition on both banks. Evelyn walked the line with him because Mason had asked her to, not because he couldn't do it himself, but because she had written the letter and she understood what Reardon was verifying, and Mason needed to be with Hector moving the last of the eastern cattle to the north pasture before the assessment was complete. Reardon worked, and she answered his questions, and she watched him make his notes with the careful attention of a man who understood that his signature on a document meant something. "How long has this ranch been operating the eastern parcel?" he asked, not looking up from his notes. Mason's grandfather filed the original claim in 1868. The eastern acres have been part of the ranch since then. "And the creek runs through it year-round. Seasonal variation, but yes, substantially year-round. No mining operations upstream. Nothing within 12 miles. I checked the territorial survey maps." He looked up at that. "You checked the survey maps?" "I wanted to make sure my letter was accurate." He held her gaze for a moment, then went back to his notes with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. When Mason returned from the north pasture, Reardon was closing his sample case and writing the final notation on his assessment form. Mason came and stood beside Evelyn and didn't speak, and she could feel the tension in him, the controlled, compressed way he held himself when he was waiting for something that mattered. "Clean," Reardon said without looking up. "All 5 sample points. No contamination of any kind. Flow rate consistent with healthy watershed conditions." He signed the bottom of the form and dated it. "I'll have the official finding filed with the territorial office by Friday. If someone submits a flag against this property after that filing, they'll be submitting it against a documented clean assessment conducted by this office." He looked at Mason. "That's a difficult position to maintain without very solid evidence, or without the inspector they'd arranged," Mason said. Reardon's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened slightly. "I wouldn't know anything about that." "No," Mason said. "You wouldn't." Reardon shook Mason's hand, and then to Evelyn's slight surprise turned and shook hers as well. "Good letter," he said. Then he got on his horse and rode back toward Laramie. Mason stood beside Evelyn and watched him go. The relief in the yard was almost physical. She could feel it in Mason beside her, in the way his shoulders dropped by a fraction, in the way he exhaled once slowly, like he'd been holding something in for days. "It holds," he said. "It holds." He was quiet for a moment. "Webb will know by Friday." "Yes?" "He'll be angry." "Probably." "And he'll look for another angle." He turned to look at her. "You said that yourself." "I did." She met his eyes. "But he'll have lost the boundary claim and the environmental flag in the same week. That's not a man who's winning. That's a man who's running out of approaches." "Running out of approaches isn't the same as stopping." "No," she agreed, "but it changes the shape of what he can do." Mason was quiet again. She had stopped trying to fill his silences. They were a form of thinking for him, not absence, and she had learned that interrupting them was the same as interrupting someone mid-sentence. "You've been here 18 days, he said finally. She had not been counting, but she knew he was right. "The month isn't up," she said. "No." Something moved in his expression. "But you've done more in 18 days than most people do in a year on this ranch." She didn't know what to do with that. She looked away. "The partnership offer," he said, "still stands." She looked back at him. "I haven't decided yet," she said. "I know." He looked at the eastern fence line, the one that Hector and Tom had repaired and that Reardon had just documented as the boundary of clean land. "But I wanted you to know it still stands." He walked back toward the barn. Evelyn stood in the yard alone and felt the Wyoming sky enormous above her, and thought about 18 days, and thought about the east room with the morning window, and thought about a man who said important things as flatly as he said ordinary things, like wait was not a reason to avoid something. The fever arrived 3 days later, and it arrived without warning. The way fevers always did, with the terrifying speed of something that had been building silently before it became visible. A man named Carl Briggs came to the ranch at dawn. He was a homesteader with a small operation 8 miles north, and he came riding hard enough that Hector heard the horse before Carl reached the yard and came out of the bunkhouse already pulling on his coat. Carl was off his horse before it fully stopped. His face was gray. "My boy," he said. "He's burning up. Started last night. We thought it was just a summer cold, but it's not. It moved too fast. He can't keep water down and his temperature." Carl's voice broke. He was a big man, the kind that didn't break easily, and the breaking was terrible to witness. "The doctor in Laramie, I sent my hired man for him yesterday, and he's not back yet, and I don't know if—" Mason was already in the yard. "How old?" 7. "How long has he had the fever?" "Since yesterday noon. It's been a full day." Evelyn came out of the house. She had heard the horse and Carl's voice through the window, and she had already pulled on her coat and picked up the medicine box from the kitchen shelf, the one May kept stocked with what a working ranch needed when the doctor was too far away. Mason looked at her. She looked back at him. "I've managed fever before," she said. "Children and adults both. Carl's homestead is 8 miles north. Then we should go now." She looked at Carl. "Is your wife with him?" "Yes. She hasn't slept." "Is there anyone else in the house?" "No." "All right." She turned to May, who had appeared in the doorway. "Willow bark. The good stock, not the powder. And the chamomile and the clean linen strips from the back shelf." May was already moving. Carl looked at Evelyn the way people looked at capable strangers in desperate moments, with a gratitude so raw it was almost painful to see. Do you know? I know enough," she said. "Let's go." Mason saddled 2 horses while May packed what Evelyn asked for. They were riding north within 10 minutes of Carl arriving in the yard. The morning was cold and the ground was hard, and Evelyn rode with the medicine satchel over her shoulder and kept pace with Mason without effort, which she could feel him notice. Carl rode ahead. He set a pace that was just short of reckless, and she understood it. A father riding toward his sick child moved at the speed of fear. Halfway there, Mason pulled alongside her. The horses were breathing hard. "Have you done this before?" he asked, not doubting, genuinely asking. "When I was 22, my neighbor's daughter had a fever that went 3 days. The doctor was out of town." She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "She survived." What did you do? Kept her cool, kept her hydrated, kept her mother calm enough to help. She glanced at him. The last part is the hardest. He was quiet for a moment, riding. What do you need from me when we get there? The question landed quietly. What do you need from me? Not what should I do or tell me what you want. What do you need? Like her answer was the operating parameter for everything that followed. Hot water constantly. Someone to ride for more willow bark if we run out. And Carl out of the room, he's going to be in the way of himself. I'll manage, Carl. Good. They rode the rest of the way without talking. And it wasn't the silence of strangers, but the silence of people who had already said what needed saying and were saving their energy for what was coming. The boy's name was James. He was 7 years old and small for it, and when Evelyn walked into that room, she felt the heat from him before she reached the bedside. His mother, a thin, exhausted woman named Ruth, who had been awake for a day and a half, turned from the bed with eyes so hollow they made Evelyn's chest ache. He kept asking for water, Ruth said. I kept giving it to him, but he can't keep it. Small amounts, Evelyn said. Tiny amounts very frequently. Not enough to make him sick again. She set the satchel down and opened it. What's his name? James? Yes, James. She put her hand on the boy's forehead. The fever was high. Too high to be comfortable, but not yet the kind that took people. James, my name is Evelyn. I'm going to help you feel better. Can you open your eyes for me? The boy's eyes opened. They were fever-bright and confused, but they opened. Good, she said, keeping her voice steady and warm, the voice she'd learned you used with sick children, not falsely cheerful, not anxious, just solid, like a fixed point. That's very good. I need you to drink just a little bit of water for me right now. She worked through the morning without stopping. She kept James cool with the damp linen strips. She administered the willow bark in small doses carefully timed. She showed Ruth the rhythm of it, the intervals, the amounts, the specific signs to watch for, because a mother who understood what she was doing was worth 3 extra sets of hands. She talked to James steadily when he was awake, keeping him anchored and calm. And when he drifted into the half-sleep of high fever, she kept the compress changing and watched his color and his breathing with the focused attention of someone who understood that fever moved in waves, and the worst of it often came when you thought the worst had passed. Mason kept Carl out of the room. She didn't know exactly what he said or did, but when she stepped out once to get more water, she saw the 2 men sitting at the kitchen table. Carl, with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and Mason talking to him in a low voice, with that particular quiet authority of his. Carl's face was still gray, but the wild desperation had settled into something more manageable, grief being held by a steady hand. She went back in. By noon, the fever had begun to move. Not gone, these things didn't go in hours, but the terrible peaked intensity of it had crested and begun the slow work of coming down. James opened his eyes more frequently. He kept water down twice in a row. His color changed barely, but visibly. Ruth began to cry. Silently, with her hand over her mouth, the tears she'd been holding back for 30 hours because she'd needed to be steady for her son. Evelyn put her hand on Ruth's arm and let her cry. When James fell into a real sleep. Not the fever sleep, but the recovery sleep, different in quality, the breathing slower and more even. Evelyn came out to the kitchen. Her back ached from hours of bending, and her hands were tired, and she was profoundly bone-deep exhausted in the way that only pure focus sustained through physical strain could make you. Carl stood up when she came in. He was a big man, but he looked like something had been taken out of him, and he was only beginning to understand it might be put back. He's sleeping, she said. The fever is dropping. Someone needs to stay with him through the night, Ruth will, and she knows what to watch for now. Keep him on the willow bark on schedule. Get the doctor here tomorrow regardless, even if the fever is gone. Carl looked at her with the expression of a man who had no adequate words for what had happened in the past 6 hours and knew it. Miss Carter, he said. His voice was rough. I don't know how to... Don't, she said gently. He's a good boy. I could tell even through the fever. She meant it. Carl pressed his lips together and nodded and looked away, and she understood he needed a moment to collect himself, so she turned to the stove and poured herself a cup of coffee, and when she turned back, Mason was watching her from across the kitchen. She had half forgotten he was there. The hours with James had narrowed her world to that room, and that boy and Mason had been outside it steady and present and managing the things that needed managing, so she could focus on the thing that was hers to do. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not the measuring look, not the careful flatness. Something that hadn't found its name yet. She drank her coffee. The ride back to Red Ridge was slower. The urgency that had driven them north was gone, and what replaced it was the particular quietness of people who had been through something together that changed the texture of the air between them. Halfway back, Mason said, "You told me the hardest part was keeping the mother calm." "It usually is." Ruth Briggs was calm after the first 10 minutes. She's a strong woman. Evelyn shifted in the saddle. She just needed someone to show her where to put the strength. Mason was quiet for a stretch. The horses walked at an easy pace, and the afternoon light had gone gold and low, and the land moved around them in its enormous, indifferent way. "My wife," he said. Evelyn went very still. She didn't speak. She understood without needing to analyze it that this moment was fragile in the specific way of things that had been held back for a very long time, that one wrong word or movement could close it. "Her name was Clara," he said. "She died of a fever, similar to what the Briggs boy had." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. His voice was level in the way that levelness was sometimes an enormous amount of work. "There was no one like you there, no one who knew what to do." A pause. "The doctor came from Laramie, but he came too late, and there was nothing." He stopped. Evelyn waited. "I watched her die," he said. Quiet. Flat. The flatness of something that had been said before only in his own head and was strange to say aloud. "And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help her, and she kept telling me it was all right, that she wasn't afraid." He paused again. "She was lying. To protect me. And I knew she was lying, and I couldn't do anything about it." Evelyn looked at him. He was staring ahead, his jaw set. His hands easy on the reins despite what was happening in his voice. "Mason," she said. He looked at her. The afternoon light was on his face, and she could see clearly for the first time what May had meant about scar tissue. It wasn't coldness. It was the shape a person took when they had carried something very heavy for very long and had reorganized their whole self around the weight of it. "Today wasn't about Clara," she said carefully. "James Briggs is alive because you rode 8 miles in the cold to take me there, and you kept Carl Briggs together so he didn't fall apart on his son, and you made sure I had what I needed to do the work." She held his gaze. "That's not nothing. It's not what I failed to do 4 years ago." "No," she said. "It's what you did today." She paused. "You can carry what happened to Clara. You should. She was your wife, and she deserves to be carried." Her voice was steady and gentle and completely honest. "But you can't let it be the only story you know how to tell about yourself." Something crossed his face. She wasn't sure what it was, it moved too quickly, but his jaw shifted and his eyes moved away briefly, and when they came back there was something different in them. Something that had been locked and was considering very carefully whether to unlock. "She would have liked you," he said. Evelyn hadn't expected that. She felt it land somewhere she hadn't prepared. "I think I would have liked her," she said. They rode the rest of the way back to Red Ridge in the quiet of that, and it was the most intimate silence they had shared, yet not because of what was in it, but because of what had been taken out a wall that had been load-bearing and was now just a space. May had dinner ready and hot when they got back. She asked no questions about James Briggs. She would hear the story in time, and she set plates on the table and coffee on the stove and disappeared into her evening routine with the tact of someone who understood that some conversations needed a table and food and the ordinary structure of a meal to find their way into. Mason sat across from Evelyn at the kitchen table, and they ate, and the hands came through the kitchen for their plates and filtered back out, and gradually the house quieted. Hector stopped in the doorway before he went to the bunkhouse. "Heard you rode to the Briggs place," he said. "Boy had a fever," Mason said. Hector looked at Evelyn. He was a man of few words, 8 years with this ranch, and he looked at her with the straightforward respect of someone who assessed people by what they did rather than how they explained themselves. "Good," he said, and went out. Evelyn looked at her plate. "Hector doesn't say things he doesn't mean," Mason said. "I know. That's his version of a speech." She almost smiled. "I understood that." Mason poured more coffee. He looked at his cup for a moment. "The partnership offer," he said. She looked up. "I want to change the terms." Her chest did something she ignored. "Change them how? The financial arrangement is still part of it." He set the coffee down. "But I want to add something." He looked at her directly the way he always looked at things he was serious about, straight on, no deflection. "I want you to know why I'm asking." "All right. When Clara died, I decided I would run this ranch alone. Not because I wanted to, because the idea of building something with someone and then losing it again was—" He stopped, found the word. "Intolerable." His voice was flat and honest and quiet. "So I made myself practical instead. I answered a correspondence advertisement because I thought a practical arrangement with practical terms was something I could manage without it costing anything I didn't have left to spend. And then Rose didn't come," Evelyn said. "And then you came instead." He looked at his hands. "And you haven't done a single thing I expected. Is that a complaint?" The corner of his mouth moved. "No." She waited. "I'm not asking you to feel something you don't feel," he said. This isn't—" He stopped again, and she could see him working through language that didn't come naturally, trying to say something accurately that he wasn't used to saying. "What I'm asking is whether you would consider staying, not for the month, not for a fixed period." He looked up. "Whether you would consider this place as something that could be yours as well as mine." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the Wyoming wind had picked up, moving through the yard, the way it always did in the evenings, restless, searching. Evelyn sat with what he had said and let it settle rather than reaching for it or pushing it away. She thought about Ohio and the house with the mortgage, and Rose at the top of the stairs, and the train leaving the platform behind her. She thought about 18 days that had already changed her more than she'd expected. She thought about a man who had just told her the truth about himself in the plainest words he could find, because accuracy mattered more to him than comfort. "I'm not Rose," she said. "I know that. I'm not what you planned for. I know. And this isn't— I'm not going to be someone who makes this easier by pretending it's simpler than it is." "I don't want easier," he said. "I want honest." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. This man who was scar tissue and steadiness, and a barn full of his grandfather's letters he'd avoided for 12 years, who had kept a town from losing its creek water, who had ridden 8 miles in the cold without being asked, who had kept Carl Briggs from coming apart at the seams while his son burned with fever inside. "Ask me again," she said, "when the month is up." Something in his face shifted. Not disappointment. Something closer to the beginning of certainty, like a foundation deciding it was going to hold. "All right," he said. "But Mason—" He looked at her. "I already know what I'm going to say." The silence after that was different from every silence that had come before it. It had weight and warmth and the quality of something that had been earned rather than found. May appeared in the kitchen doorway with a look on her face that suggested she had absolutely not been listening from the hallway and was simply happening to pass through at this particular moment. "More coffee?" she asked. "Please," Evelyn said. May poured it with the composure of a woman who was very pleased with herself and had no intention of admitting it. Outside, the wind moved over Red Ridge Ranch and through the eastern fence line and along the clean creek that Reardon had certified and the land had always been, and somewhere in the north pasture, the cattle were settling for the night and the last light was leaving the sky in long, slow stages, the way it did out here, like it didn't want to go. Evelyn drank her coffee. She thought 12 days left in the month. She thought, it won't feel like enough time. And then she stopped thinking about time at all, and just sat in the kitchen that had started to feel like it remembered her, and let the evening do what evenings did in this place, settle and quiet, and become something almost like belonging. The letter from Webb's lawyer arrived on a Tuesday 9 days before the month was up. Evelyn was in the office. She had started calling it that, in her head, though it was technically Mason's study, a small room off the main hall where the desk lived and the ledgers lived, and where she now spent 2 hours every morning before breakfast, organizing the financial records that had accumulated in various states of disorder over 4 years of a man running a ranch by himself and considering paperwork the least urgent of his problems. May brought the letter in without comment, which was how May communicated that she had already formed an opinion about it. Evelyn looked at the return address. Webb and Associates, Laramie Territorial District. She set it on the desk and went to find Mason. He was in the barn with Hector working through the pre-winter equipment check, the kind of systematic preparation that a ranch this size required before the season turned, and that Mason approached with the same focused thoroughness he brought to everything that had a practical purpose. She stood in the barn doorway and said his name, and he looked up from the harness he was examining and read her face and set the harness down. "Webb," she said. He came out of the barn. They walked back to the office together, and he opened the letter and read it standing, which was how Mason read things he expected to be unpleasant on his feet with the option to move. She watched his face. It didn't change. That was the thing about Mason that she had come to understand was not coldness, but discipline. He had trained himself not to show reaction until he had finished processing, because he had learned that showing reaction prematurely cost you something in whatever came next. He finished reading and set the letter on the desk. "He's challenging the Water Authority assessment," he said. She picked up the letter. She read it herself quickly and felt the particular cold clarity that came when someone did something you'd half expected and you needed to think rather than react. Webb's lawyer was arguing that the Reardon assessment had been improperly requested, that it had been solicited not by the property owner through proper channels, but through a private letter written by a person with no official standing relative to the property. The lawyer was requesting that the assessment be set aside, pending review of the request procedure, and that in the interim, the environmental flag originally submitted be reinstated. It was precise, it was technical, and it had just enough procedural legitimacy to be dangerous. "He's not wrong about the request," Evelyn said. "Technically, I wrote the letter, and I'm not a partner of record." "You're not a partner of record," Mason said carefully, "because we haven't filed the partnership documentation." She looked at him. "Which I should have done 2 weeks ago," he said, "when I made the offer. I told you I needed until the end of the month. I know what you told me." His jaw was set. "And I waited because I said I would. But if you had been a partner of record when Reardon came, that letter would be legally unassailable." The air in the office went tight. "Mason," she said. "I'm not blaming you," he said immediately. "I'm blaming the situation, and myself for not moving faster on the documentation regardless of whether the month was up." He picked up the letter again. "How long do we have to respond?" 20 days. But if we wait 20 days, the flag gets reinstated in the interim, and Webb uses that window to file something else, yes." He set the letter down again. "What's the fastest counter?" she thought. She had been thinking since she picked up the letter, running the sequences the way her father had taught her to run them forward and backward, looking for the point where intervention had the most leverage. "2 things simultaneously," she said. "First, we file the partnership documentation today. Not eventually. Today. It won't retroactively validate the Reardon request, but it establishes current standing that makes any future challenge to my involvement significantly harder. She looked at him. Second, we contact Reardon directly and ask him to voluntarily refile the assessment under Mason's direct request, citing my letter as initial notification that prompted the owner's formal request. It rewrites the procedural sequence slightly, but it's not inaccurate. You knew about the request. You approved it. Mason looked at her for a long moment. You thought of that in the time it took us to walk from the barn. I thought of the first part. The second part came just now. Will Reardon do it? He's an honest man who doesn't want his clean assessment invalidated on a technicality arranged by someone he probably already knows is corrupt. She met Mason's eyes. I think he'll do it. Then we need to go to town. Yes. Today. Now. He didn't hesitate. He called to Hector through the window to handle the afternoon work, told May they'd be back before dark, and had the horses ready in the time it took Evelyn to put the Webb letter in her satchel, along with the partnership documentation she had, with some private foresight already drafted 2 weeks ago, and left folded in the back of the ledger where it had been waiting for the right moment. She pulled it out and looked at it for 1 second before she put it in the satchel. The right moment, it turned out, had not been the one she'd imagined. But it was here. Aldrich read the Webb letter and the draft partnership agreement in sequence, and his expression went through 3 distinct phases: concern, consideration, and then a kind of careful professional satisfaction. File the partnership today, he said. I'll have it registered at the territorial office before close of business. He looked at Mason. This establishes Miss Carter as co-owner of record for Red Ridge Ranch. She'll have full legal standing on all matters related to the property. That's the intent, Mason said. Aldrich looked between them. You understand, this is a legally binding arrangement. This isn't a preliminary document. I understand what I'm signing, Evelyn said. Aldrich looked at her with the expression of a man who believed her and was slightly surprised to find that he did. The Reardon situation, your approach is sound. I'd suggest sending the request by messenger today so it reaches him before Webb's lawyer has a chance to speak to him privately. Webb would do that, Mason asked. Webb has done considerably more creative things than that, Aldrich said with the careful tone of someone choosing words that were accurate without being actionable. Get Reardon the request before end of day. They left Aldrich's office 40 minutes later with the partnership documents signed and filed, and a messenger already on his way to the Water Authority office with a formal letter in Mason's hand, requesting that the assessment be attributed to his direct authorization. On the boardwalk outside, Evelyn stood in the sharp autumn air and felt something settle in her that she hadn't realized had been unsettled. The document was real now. Her name was on a deed. Her standing was legal and permanent, and no longer dependent on an informal arrangement or a month-long trial or a man's word alone. She had not asked for this. She had not come to Wyoming looking for land or legal standing or anything beyond the chance to correct a mistake her family had made. But she was standing on a Laramie boardwalk with her name on a deed to a ranch she had spent 26 days learning to love, and the feeling that came with that was not what she'd expected. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter and more solid. The feeling of weight that belonged to you rather than weight you were carrying for someone else. Mason was watching her. All right, he said. Yes. She looked at him. You. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave everything. Yes, he said. I think so. They were walking back to where the horses were tied when Webb appeared. He came from the direction of the bank with his lawyer beside him, and a third man she didn't recognize, heavy-set, with the careful posture of someone who had official standing of some kind. Webb saw them, and stopped, and the 3 men arranged themselves in a way that was not quite blocking the street, but had the quality of an obstacle nonetheless. Mason, Webb said. His voice was pleasant in the oily way it always was. And Miss Carter, was it? He smiled. Still here, Evelyn said. Interesting. Webb's eyes moved to Mason. I imagine you've seen our communication. Your lawyer's communication, Mason said. Yes, just a procedural question. Webb spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable men discussing reasonable things. I'm sure it'll resolve itself. His eyes moved back to Evelyn with that calculating assessment she'd disliked from the first time she'd seen him. Though I do wonder, Miss Carter, whether you fully understand the complexity of what you've involved yourself in. This is territorial land law. It can get quite difficult for people who don't have a firm legal standing in the matter. Evelyn looked at him steadily. You mean people without property rights? I mean people who are guests, in a legal sense. I see. She reached into her satchel and produced the copy of the partnership filing that Aldrich had given her. She didn't hand it to Webb, she held it in a way that allowed him to see it clearly. Then it's fortunate that I'm no longer a guest. Webb's pleasant expression didn't disappear. It recalibrated. She could see it happening, the rapid internal adjustment of a man who had expected a certain position and found it already occupied. A partnership filing, he said. Registered this afternoon at the territorial office. She put it back in the satchel. Was there something else? The third man, the one she didn't recognize, was watching the exchange with an expression she couldn't read. Webb smiled again, thinner this time. Congratulations, he said with the warmth of someone congratulating a person on something he intended to reverse. Mason? Miss Carter. He tipped his hat and walked past them. His lawyer followed. The third man paused for one moment and looked at Evelyn with something in his expression that was almost apologetic. Then he followed the other two. Evelyn watched them go. Beside her, Mason was very still. The third man, she said quietly. I saw him. Who is he? His name is Daniel Greer. Mason's voice was flat. He's the county land registrar. She turned to look at him. The county land registrar was with Webb. Yes. The implications of that settled over her like cold water. Not just that Webb had friends in official positions, she'd known that, but that the man responsible for recording property transactions, including the one they had just filed, was in Webb's company within an hour of that filing. Aldrich, she said immediately. Yes. We need to go back. They were already moving. Aldrich's expression when they told him was the most unguarded she'd seen it, a flash of something that was close to alarm, quickly controlled. Greer has no authority to interfere with a filing that's already been submitted, he said carefully. He has authority over how filings are recorded, Mason said. And when? The filing was submitted in the presence of witnesses, my clerk and myself. The timestamp is established. Can it be challenged? Aldrich was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly too long. A registrar who wished to complicate a filing could create procedural delays that would make the document's legal force temporarily uncertain. Not permanent, not final, but enough to create a window for Webb to act during the uncertainty, Evelyn finished. Yes. Aldrich looked at his desk. I want to be clear that I'm not saying Greer would do that. I'm saying that in theory, Aldrich, Mason said. Would he do that? The lawyer pressed his lips together. Greer has accommodated certain interests in the past in ways that were not entirely inconsistent with Webb's preferred outcomes. Then we need the filing confirmed through a channel Greer can't touch, Evelyn said. Is there one? Aldrich thought. The Territorial Governor's Office maintains a duplicate registry for disputed properties. If I file a copy directly with the Governor's Land Secretary today, before close of business, it creates a parallel record that the county registrar has no jurisdiction over. Can you do that today? It requires a specific request citing potential interference with due process. He looked at them both. That's a serious claim. We just watched the county land registrar leave a meeting with the man contesting our property rights, Mason said. How serious does it need to be? Aldrich pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward himself and reached for his pen. Close the door on your way out, he said. I'll need an hour. They waited in the street. The afternoon had gone cold and the town moved around them with its ordinary business, and Evelyn stood beside Mason and thought about how many levers Webb had managed to find, and how many of them they had only discovered by being in the right place at the right moment. If Catherine hadn't come to us, she said, we wouldn't have known about the inspector. And if we hadn't gone to Aldrich today, we wouldn't have known about Greer. She looked at him. He's been doing this for 8 years, to 5 ranches. That's what Catherine said. 5 ranches. And this is how he does it, not one big attack. 100 small ones, each one technically defensible. Each one designed to cost you more time and money than you have. She thought about the billing errors she'd found in the first week. The $90 quietly bleeding from the account. He doesn't need to win decisively. He just needs you to run out of resources to keep defending. Mason looked at her. You're describing a strategy. I'm describing his strategy, which means we need to stop reacting to each move separately and start closing the access points. She looked at the lawyer's office door. Greer is one access point. The inspector was another. The boundary claim was another. Each time he loses one, he finds the next. What are we missing? She thought about Webb's face on the boardwalk. The pleasant recalibration when she'd shown him the partnership filing. The way his eyes had moved, not defeated, still calculating. He knows something we don't, she said. He wouldn't have let us see Greer and his company if he thought we had a move that could stop him. He's comfortable with where he is. She looked at Mason. What haven't we checked? Mason was quiet for a long moment. The water rights, he said slowly. She went still. What about them? The eastern parcel has the creek, but the water rights for the creek were filed separately from the land claim. My grandfather filed them at the same time, but they're a separate document. He paused. I haven't looked at them. Where are they filed? County Water Registry. He looked at her. Under Greer's office. The cold that moved through her wasn't from the air. Mason, she said carefully. If Webb has someone inside the County Water Registry, he could have altered the water rights record. Mason's voice had gone very flat. The controlled flatness of someone keeping something large very contained. Or created a competing claim. Or filed a transfer that was never authorized. Could your grandfather have signed anything? No. Certain. Immediate. He was meticulous. He kept everything. Like the boxes in the barn loft. They looked at each other. We need to get back to the ranch, she said. The loft. The water rights filing. If he kept the original land correspondence, he kept the water rights documentation. She was already moving toward the horses. We need the original before we know if there's something to fight. They rode back to Red Ridge faster than was comfortable and went straight to the barn loft while May was still setting the table for supper. Hector saw them come in and read the situation and didn't ask questions, just lit a second lamp and handed it up without being asked. The water rights documents were in the third box. Evelyn found them in 20 minutes folded inside a leather envelope that had been sealed with wax that had gone brittle and brown over the decades. She opened it carefully the way you open something that might be the last piece of an argument you'd been losing. The original water rights filing. Her grandfather's name. The date. The creek designation. The acreage. And at the bottom, in ink that was still legible, a notation she had to read twice before she was certain she was reading it correctly. Mason. He came to look over her shoulder. The water rights, she said, were filed in perpetuity with a covenant attached. She pointed to the clause at the bottom. A covenant that says the rights revert to the territorial commons if the land changes ownership more than once in a 20-year period without the water rights being refiled under the new ownership. Mason was very still. The partnership filing, he said, counts as a change of ownership, partial but legally qualifying under this covenant. She looked at him. If Webb has this document, if he or Greer found it in the county registry and understood what it meant, he's waiting for us to file the partnership. The silence that followed was the kind that happened when something clicked into place that made the whole shape of things suddenly clear. He didn't try to stop the partnership filing, she said. He let us see Greer with him. He let us see him on the boardwalk. He wanted us to know he knew. She was working through it rapidly, feeling the architecture of what Webb had constructed. He's been pushing us toward filing the partnership because once we file, the covenant activates and he can challenge the water rights as reverted to the territorial commons, which he can then apply to purchase the Eastern Creek, Mason said. Without water rights to the creek, the eastern parcel is grazing land with no reliable water access. She looked at him. Which makes it worthless for cattle and highly attractive to someone who wants to acquire it at distressed prices after you've been forced to sell. Mason looked at the original document in her hands. His jaw was set and his eyes were hard, but he wasn't angry, not in the hot reactive sense. He was cold and clear in the way she had come to understand was his most dangerous state. "Can the covenant be voided?" he said. "I don't know. I've never seen this exact clause before." She looked at the document. But it was written in 1868, and territorial land law has changed considerably since then. A covenant this restrictive might not survive a modern legal challenge. Or it might. Or it might. She met his eyes. "We need Aldrich to see this tonight." "Aldrich is still at his office filing the governor's copy." "Then we ride back to town." He looked at her. The lamplight was on her face, and the loft was cold, and they had ridden 12 miles today already, and supper was on the table downstairs, and it was not a reasonable proposition. "Now," he said. "He's going to move the moment that partnership is registered," she said. "If the governor's office copy establishes the filing before he can challenge the water rights, we might have time. But we need Aldrich to see this covenant tonight and tell us whether the registration should be temporarily paused while we sort out the water rights situation." Something moved across Mason's face that she recognized as the specific frustration of a man who had built something with his hands over 38 years and was now watching it be attacked by paperwork he'd never anticipated. "My grandfather built this ranch with $600 and a mule," he said. "He homesteaded land nobody else wanted, and he spent 20 years turning it into something real." His voice was controlled and quiet. "And Webb is going to dismantle it with a covenant nobody knew existed." "No," she said. "He's not." He looked at her. "He's not," she said again. "Because your grandfather also kept every piece of paper he ever touched, and it's been sitting in a barn loft waiting for someone to need it." She held up the leather envelope. "We have the original. Webb only has whatever copy exists in the county registry, and county registry documents can be challenged with original documentation." "Can they ask Aldrich?" She was already moving toward the ladder. "Tonight." She heard him behind her coming down. She heard him call to Hector to saddle the horses again, and she heard Hector's response wordless, just the sound of a man who understood without needing the explanation, and she went inside long enough to tell May they wouldn't be at supper. May looked at her face, and then at the leather envelope in her hands and said, "I'll keep it warm," and that was all. They rode back to Laramie in the dark, and the Wyoming sky above them was vast and cold and full of stars, and Evelyn rode with the leather envelope in her satchel against her side, and thought about a man in 1868 who had filed his water rights with a covenant he thought was protecting him, and had instead left a trap buried in the paperwork for his grandson to fall into 50 years later. She thought, not if I can help it. Aldrich was still in his office coat on, ready to leave. He looked at them in his doorway with the expression of a man who had spent too many years in territorial law to be surprised by anything, but was occasionally startled anyway. "Come in," he said, stepping back. "Close the door." She put the leather envelope on his desk. "Read the covenant at the bottom." He read it. She watched his face go through the same sequence hers had, the careful reading, the rereading, the particular stillness of someone finding something significant in a document they hadn't expected to find it in. He set it down. "How long have you had this?" he said. 40 minutes. "Where was it?" "The barn loft," Mason said. "Same place as the boundary documentation." Aldrich looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at the document again. "This covenant is enforceable as written," he said, "under 1868 territorial law." Evelyn's chest went tight. "However," Aldrich said, and the word landed like a handhold on a cliff face. Territorial water law was substantially revised in 1882. The revision included a grandfather clause for existing water rights holders that specifically supersedes restrictive covenants that would otherwise cause automatic reversion. He looked at Evelyn. Meaning this covenant, if challenged after 1882, would need to be litigated under the revised statute. And under the revised statute, a partial change of ownership through partnership does not qualify as a full transfer triggering reversion. He paused. The covenant is effectively void under current law. The relief was so immediate and physical that Evelyn had to set her hand on Aldrich's desk for one moment. Mason exhaled. Once. Slowly. Webb knew this, she said. Aldrich looked at her carefully. If Webb's lawyers reviewed the covenant, they would know it's unenforceable under current statute. Then he wasn't planning to win the water rights challenge. She worked it through. He was planning to threaten it, to make us believe it was viable so we'd pause the partnership filing while we investigated, which would give him time to... She stopped, looked at Mason. The boundary appeal. Aldrich, did you file the governor's copy? Yes, an hour ago. Before we rode back here? Yes, it's registered. She looked at Mason. That's what he needed the delay for. Not the water rights, those were never going to hold up. He needed us distracted and riding back and forth to town while the window on the boundary appeal stayed open. The room was very quiet. How much time does the boundary appeal window give him? Mason said. Aldrich checked a document on his desk. The response period ends Friday. Today is Tuesday. Yes, and the governor's copy was filed before close of business today, which means the partnership is registered and the boundary assessment stands regardless of what Greer does at the county level, Aldrich said. Webb's window closed tonight. Mason looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. He's out of moves, she said. Not triumphant, just accurate. For now. For now, she agreed. But he's lost the boundary, the environmental flag, the water rights threat, and the procedural challenge to the assessment. All in 3 weeks, she paused. Men like Webb cut their losses when the cost of continuing exceeds what they stand to gain. You think he'll stop? I think he'll look for a target that hasn't closed every door he tries. She held Mason's gaze. We need to make sure every door is closed. Aldrich cleared his throat. I can prepare a comprehensive filing summary, every document, every registered claim, every challenge and its resolution that establishes a complete legal record for Red Ridge Ranch. Something that makes future challenges significantly more difficult to initiate. He paused. It's not urgent, but it would be thorough. Do it, Mason said, whatever it costs. They left Aldrich's office at 9 o'clock at night the second time in the same day, and the Laramie Street was dark and cold and nearly empty. Their horses waited where they'd tied them, patient, in the way that horses were patient when they'd been given no choice about it. Mason stood beside his horse for a moment before mounting. He wasn't looking at anything specific. He was doing the thing he did when he was processing something he hadn't finished yet. She waited. When I came to that station to pick up Rose Carter, he said, I had a specific idea of what the next year of my life was going to look like. A practical arrangement with practical terms. Yes. He looked at her. And instead I got a woman who finds 15-year-old letters in my barn and rides to town twice in one day and closes legal doors I didn't know were open. That's one way to describe it. Is there another way? She thought about it honestly. You got someone who couldn't stay out of things that needed doing, she said. That's all it's ever been. He looked at her in the dark street, this man who had spent 4 years making himself smaller so that losing something again would cost less, and she could see on his face the specific effort of someone choosing to be larger than that again, choosing to let something matter at the risk of what mattering cost. I'm glad the train was late, he said. She looked at him. What? The day you arrived, the train was 40 minutes late. I almost left the platform. He held her gaze. I didn't. She understood looking at him what it cost him to say that, what it meant that he was saying it. Mason, she said. He waited. I already told you I know what I'm going to say when the month is up. You did. I'm saying it now. She kept her eyes on his. Yes, this place, this work, this... She stopped, found the honest version of it. Yes. The word sat between them in the cold Laramie night, simple and irrevocable. He nodded once, slowly, the way he did when something had been confirmed that he had been quietly certain of for a while, and was only now allowing himself to know. Then let's go home, he said. They mounted and rode, and the stars above Wyoming were indifferent and enormous and beautiful in the way of things that had been there long before either of them arrived and would remain long after, and the 12 miles back to Red Ridge Ranch had never felt shorter. The letter from Rose arrived on a Thursday morning 3 days after the ride back from Laramie. May brought it in with the breakfast coffee, set it beside Evelyn's plate without comment, and went back to the stove. The handwriting on the front was Rose's, the looping, unhurried script of a woman who had always written as though she had all the time in the world and fully expected the world to wait for her. Evelyn looked at it for a moment before she opened it. Mason was already at the table. He saw the handwriting, and he saw her face, and he said nothing, which was the right thing. He poured his coffee and gave her the space of it. She opened the letter. Rose wrote the way she talked in long, warm, slightly breathless sentences that moved from one thing to the next with the confidence of someone who assumed the person reading was glad to follow along. She was well. She was happy. She had met a man, a schoolteacher in Columbus, gentle and patient, and very fond of music, and things were moving in a direction that felt right, in a way the rancher arrangement had never felt right, and she was sorry for that. She wrote. She was truly sorry, but she thought Evelyn probably understood by now why she couldn't have gone. Then, near the bottom of the letter, Rose's handwriting changed slightly. Got slower, more careful. I have been thinking about you every day, Ev. I know what I asked you to do, what I let you do, because I was too frightened to face it myself. I know what that cost. I want you to know I don't take it lightly, even if I seem like someone who takes everything lightly. I take you seriously. I always have. I hope Wyoming is treating you well. I hope the rancher is someone worth the trouble. Write me and tell me you're all right. Your sister who owes you more than she can say, Rose. Evelyn read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in both hands and sat with it. Mason waited. She's happy, Evelyn said finally. She met someone, a schoolteacher. Good. She's not coming back into this story. She set the letter on the table. She was never really in it, not the real version of it. Mason looked at her across the table. Are you all right? She thought about that honestly, the way she did everything. She searched for grief or resentment or the complicated feeling of someone whose sacrifice had been quietly absorbed into someone else's life, and she found not nothing, but not those things either. What she found was something closer to clarity. The feeling of a story that had been waiting to find its actual shape, finally finding it. I came here to correct her mistake, Evelyn said. And I did, just not the way I planned. She looked at Mason. The mistake wasn't that she refused to come. The mistake was thinking this arrangement had anything to do with her in the first place. He held her gaze. It never did, he said. Not after the first 5 minutes on that platform. May made a sound at the stove that she would have described as clearing her throat, and that was in fact something considerably closer to satisfaction.
Jaman.
The blizzard came on a Sunday. It came the way the serious ones always came out here, not with the gradual buildup that gave you time to prepare, but with a sudden shift in the air that Mason felt before noon and responded to immediately. By midday, he had the hands pulling cattle from the eastern and southern pastures toward the north shelter, stacking feed in the barn, securing every door and shutter that could be secured. Evelyn worked alongside them. She didn't ask permission, and he didn't suggest she shouldn't. The month had been up for 4 days, and they both knew what she'd said on the Laramie Street, and neither of them had felt the need to formalize it beyond that. Yet there was too much to do, and they were both people who understood that what you did with your hands was the real statement, not what you signed with your name. She worked the south pasture with Tom, moving the last of the cattle through a gap in the fence line that Tom held open against the wind, which had already picked up enough that she had to lean into it. The temperature was dropping with the particular spite of a Wyoming winter that had decided to arrive in full rather than by degrees. Tom shouted something at her over the wind. "What?" she called back. "Storm's moving faster than Mason thought." She looked at the sky and understood immediately what Tom meant. The color of it had changed in the last 20 minutes, from the flat gray of a coming storm to something darker lower with the yellow-green undertone that meant this was not going to be a manageable afternoon. This was going to be a test. She got the last 3 cattle through the gap and told Tom to take them to the north shelter, and she went to find Mason. She found him at the barn, and one look at his face told her he'd already assessed what the sky was saying. "Hector and Pete are with the north herd," he said. "Tom's bringing the south group. We're short on the east." "How many still out?" 12, maybe 15. I need to ride the east fence." "I'm coming." He looked at her. The wind was already pulling at her coat, and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an hour, and he looked at her the way he had on the first day, assessing, except what he was assessing now was completely different from what he'd been measuring on that platform. "It's going to be bad," he said. "I know." "Evelyn?" "Mason." She held his gaze. "Partner." He looked at her for one more second. Then he turned and got her horse. The eastern pasture in a full Wyoming blizzard was a different world from the eastern pasture on any other day. The wind came sideways and the snow came with it, and within 20 minutes of riding east, she could feel the cold working through her coat in a way that was serious rather than uncomfortable. Her horse moved steadily. Mason had given her the older mare, the one who had done this before, and didn't panic in whiteout conditions, and she stayed close enough to Mason that she could see him through the wall of white. They found the first group of cattle bunched against the east fence, 8 of them standing with their backs to the wind with the bovine stubbornness of animals that had decided this was where they were staying, and no human was going to convince them otherwise. Mason worked one side, she worked the other. The cattle moved reluctantly, and then with more purpose as the wind sharpened, and even they understood that staying in the open was worse than following the people who were making noise at their flanks. The second group was harder, 5 animals scattered across a wide stretch of the pasture, each one requiring individual attention, and the snow was coming thick enough now that she was navigating partly by sound and partly by the dark shapes moving in the white. She pushed 2 of them west, toward where she could hear Mason's voice, and she went back for a third, and when she turned her horse to return, she realized she couldn't see Mason anymore. Not the storm, not the fence line, not the darker shapes of the cattle ahead, just white in every direction moving. She stopped her horse. The mare shifted under her uneasy, and Evelyn put her hand flat on the animal's neck and felt the warmth of it and used it to ground herself. She was not lost. She knew which direction was west because the wind was coming from the north and she could use it to orient. She was not lost. She was 20 minutes from the barn on a horse that knew this land better than she did. She called Mason's name into the wind. The wind took it and did what wind did. She called again louder, and then she heard it, not his voice, but his horse. The sound of hooves on frozen ground, the specific rhythm of a horse moving fast, coming from her left. He appeared from the white at a speed that was slightly reckless, and pulled up beside her with his coat covered in snow and his hat pulled down, and his face. She saw his face and understood looking at it that he had not heard her call and had simply been looking for her. "There you are," he said. His voice was very controlled and very tight. "I'm here," she said. "I've got 2 more west of here. We have everyone." The last group moved when the wind shifted. He looked at her face. "You're all right." "I'm fine." "You're sure?" "Mason, I'm fine." She looked at him steadily. "Let's get back." He held her gaze for one moment that was longer than necessary and considerably more full than anything they had technically said to each other. And then he turned his horse west, and she followed, and they rode back through the blizzard together. The storm lasted 22 hours. They lost 2 fence posts in the east line, and a section of the barn roof overhang that Mason and Hector had been planning to repair since September and had not gotten to. They lost no cattle. They lost no people. When the storm had settled enough to see across the yard, Evelyn stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked at the transformed landscape, the ranch blanketed in white, the fence lines marked by dark posts at intervals, the barn solid where it had always been, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that knew it was home. May came and stood beside her at the window. "You should sleep," May said. "You were up all night." "So were you." "I'm used to it." May looked out at the yard. "He hasn't come in yet." Evelyn looked. Mason was at the east fence even now, walking the line in the aftermath of the storm, checking what had held and what hadn't. She could see him from here, the dark shape of him against the white, moving deliberately the way he did everything. "He won't come in until he knows the full damage," Evelyn said. "No." May was quiet for a moment. He never did. Even the first winter after Clara. He walked every fence line the morning after every storm, even when it was clear there was nothing left to check. "I think it was the only thing that kept him—" She stopped. "Moving," Evelyn finished. "Yes." May looked at her sideways. "He's different now." Evelyn kept her eyes on the figure at the fence line. "How?" "He talks at supper," May said simply. "He didn't before. He ate, and he left, and the talking that happened at his table was mine and the hands and whatever the room made on its own." She paused. "Now he talks." Evelyn didn't say anything. "I'm not telling you this so you feel good about yourself," May said with the brisk honesty that was her consistent mode. "I'm telling you because you should know what you actually changed, not the ledgers, not the legal papers." She looked back at the window. "The talking at supper. That's what you changed." Evelyn pressed her lips together. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she had no intention of starting in May's kitchen on a Thursday morning, but she felt the weight of what May had said settle somewhere that was not her practical mind, but was something below it. "Thank you, May," she said quietly. "Don't thank me," May said, and went back to the stove. Mason came in at 9. His coat was covered in snow that was melting at the edges, and his boots left wet tracks on May's kitchen floor, which May observed with the specific expression of a woman who had made peace with this particular inevitability 20 years ago. He accepted coffee without sitting down, which meant he was still working something through. "2 fence sections in the east," he said. "The overhang on the barn is worse than I thought, needs full replacement, not repair." He looked at Evelyn. "The cattle are all accounted for." "I know. Hector counted them at 6. He nodded, drank his coffee, still didn't sit. "Mason," she said. He looked at her. "Sit down." He sat. It was the particular capitulation of a man who had been on his feet for 20 hours and needed someone to give him permission to stop. He set the coffee down and put both hands flat on the table, and she could see now that he was still how tired he was, the kind of tired that went all the way through. She sat across from him. "The fence can be fixed this week," she said. "The barn overhang can be replaced before the next storm. Hector and Tom can handle the east line today if you tell them what you need." She looked at him steadily. "You don't have to do all of it yourself." "I know that." "Do you—" He looked at her. Something moved in his expression, the slight shift she recognized as him, hearing something that landed differently than he expected. "I've been doing all of it myself for 4 years, he said. "I know. Old habits." "Yes." She held his gaze. "But you're not alone anymore." The words sat between them in May's kitchen with the smell of coffee and the sound of the wood stove, and the muffled quiet of the post-storm world outside. They were not dramatic words. They were not the words of a story, they were the words of a morning after a hard night spoken by a practical woman to a practical man who had needed to hear them for 4 years. Mason looked at her for a long time. "No," he said finally. "I'm not." The knock at the door came 2 hours later, while Evelyn was at the desk working through the storm damage assessment in the ledger. She heard it, and then she heard May answer it, and then she heard a voice she recognized. Catherine Webb. She was at the door in 30 seconds. Catherine looked different from the last time she had ridden through the aftermath of the blizzard, and it showed. And there was something about her face that was different from the controlled urgency of her first visit, something that had been released. "Come in," Evelyn said. Catherine came in. She looked around the kitchen at May at the evidence of a household that had survived the storm intact, and something in her shoulders released slightly. "Is Mason here?" "He's sleeping. First time in 20 hours. Evelyn looked at her carefully. "What happened?" Catherine sat at the kitchen table. She sat the way people sat when they had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and the carrying was finally done. "Harlan is leaving," she said. Evelyn went still. "The territory. He's leaving the territory." Catherine's voice was even, but her hands folded on the table were pressing together hard enough that the knuckles showed. "The governor's office opened an investigation 3 days ago into the land registry practices under Greer. Apparently, the parallel filing you had Aldrich submit flagged a pattern that the governor's office had been watching for some time." She paused. "Greer has already resigned. 2 of Harlan's associates are under formal review, and Webb himself, investigating his involvement in the Greer situation and 3 prior land transactions that the governor's office believes were fraudulently manipulated." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "He came home last night and told me he was leaving, that he had business interests in Colorado that needed his attention." Her mouth pulled slightly at the corner. "He meant that Colorado doesn't yet know what he did here." Evelyn looked at her. "What will you do?" Catherine met her eyes directly. "I'm not going with him." The silence after that was very complete. "I haven't been going with him," Catherine said carefully, "in any meaningful sense for several years. The decision to stay here it's not a difficult one. It's just a final one." She looked at her hands. "I have family in Laramie. I have resources of my own that Harlan doesn't know about because I've been practical about certain things for longer than he realizes." She looked up. "I wanted to come and tell you directly. You and Mason. Because what I did coming here the first time, I need you to know it wasn't strategy. It wasn't a move in whatever game Harlan was playing." "I know that," Evelyn said. "I knew it when you came." "I wanted to hear you say it." "Catherine." Evelyn held her gaze. "You rode 8 miles to warn people you didn't know about a threat you could have ignored. You put yourself at significant personal risk because you had watched something wrong happen 5 times and couldn't watch it a 6th. She paused. "That's not strategy. That's character." Catherine looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once. The way Mason nodded when something was confirmed that he had needed confirmed, with the relief of someone who had been holding a question for a very long time. "Tell Mason," Catherine said, rising. Tell him the Eastern Acres are safe, fully, and that I'm sorry it took this long for someone to do something about Harlan." "Tell him yourself," Evelyn said. "Come to supper this week." Catherine looked at her with something that was genuinely surprised. "You're inviting me to supper?" "You have nowhere better to be at the moment," Evelyn said. "And May cooks enough for twice the table." May at the stove said nothing, but her shoulders had the particular set of someone who had already decided where the extra place would go. Catherine Webb almost smiled. It was the expression of someone who had not expected kindness from this direction and was finding that it fit differently than she'd anticipated. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday." Evelyn agreed. Mason woke at noon and came to the kitchen, and Evelyn told him about Catherine while he ate the meal May put in front of him. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to everything important. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Webb is gone," he said. "Or going. The investigation will follow him eventually." "Yes. Good." He said it the way he said simple, true things flat, complete without elaboration. Then he looked at the ledger open on the desk across the room. The damage assessment. 2 fence sections the barn overhang 3 broken shutter latches on the bunkhouse. She looked at her notes. Total repair cost roughly is within the operating reserve. We won't need to pull from the spring fund. He looked at her. You already priced the materials. Tom knows the lumber yard in town. I asked him this morning while you were sleeping. She met his eyes. You were asleep. The work still needed doing. The corner of his mouth moved. Partner, he said. Partner, she agreed. He looked at her for a moment across the kitchen. This man who had come to a train platform expecting one woman and gotten a completely different person who had turned out to be exactly what the situation required, what he required. And he had the expression of someone who had been surprised by something important and was done being surprised and was ready now to simply be grateful. The fence, he said. I want to rebuild the east section properly, not just repair it. New posts, new wire, the full line. That's more than the storm damage. I know. It's been needing it for 2 years. He looked at her. I kept putting it off because it was expensive, and the alternative was functional. He paused. I don't want functional anymore. I want solid. She understood he was not talking only about the fence. Then we build it solid, she said. On the last day of October, with the eastern fence rebuilt and the barn overhang replaced and the legal documentation for Red Ridge Ranch filed in 3 separate offices across the territory, Evelyn sat at the desk in the study that was now genuinely hers as much as Mason's and wrote a letter to Rose. She wrote it the way she did everything, without decoration, without performance. She told Rose that Wyoming was cold and enormous and nothing like what she had imagined. She told her that the rancher was not easy and not soft and was exactly what the land had made him. She told her that the partnership was legal and permanent, and that her name was on a deed and in a ledger and on every document that mattered, and that she had not replaced Rose in any of it. She had become something entirely her own, in a place that had required her to. She told Rose she was happy. Not the happiness of someone who had found something easy, the happiness of someone who had found something true. She sealed the letter and set it with the outgoing mail and went to the kitchen where May was starting supper, and the hands were coming in from the afternoon work, and the ordinary sounds of a working ranch filled the house with the specific warmth of things that are real and recurring and yours. Mason came in last, as he always did, checking that everything was secure before he came in himself, which was the kind of man he was and would always be. He came into the kitchen and hung his coat and looked at Evelyn the way he had started looking at her when he thought she wasn't watching, which was the same way she looked at him when she thought the same. They had not said the word yet. They were 2 practical people, and practical people did not rush words that deserve the weight of the right moment. But the word was present in the kitchen with them, in the way they moved around each other without collision, in the way he reached past her for the coffee, and she already knew which cup was his, in the way supper happened at that table, as though the table had always been expecting all of them. May set the food down. Hector and Tom and Pete took their places. Mason sat and looked at Evelyn, and she sat across from him, and the table was loud with the ordinary conversation of people who worked together, and knew each other, and had survived a blizzard and a land fraud scheme, and 4 years of quiet loneliness, and 1 month that had turned into a lifetime. After supper, when the hands had gone, and May had retired, and the kitchen was quiet, Mason brought 2 cups of coffee to the table and sat beside her rather than across from her, which was different from every other evening. She looked at him. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. Not as a practical arrangement, he said. Not as a partnership of record. He looked at her with the directness that was his truest quality, the thing that had unsettled her on the platform and steadied her through everything that followed, because a man who said hard things straight was a man you could build something real with. As what this actually is. She held his gaze. Ask me. Will you stay? He said. Not for the ranch, not for the legal standing, not because you have nowhere better to go. He paused. Because this is where you want to be. Because I'm who you want to be here with. The kitchen held them both. The stove was warm. The Wyoming night was enormous and cold outside the window, and inside the lamp burned steady and sure. The way things burned when they had found the right place. "Mason Calloway," she said. "I got on a train to correct my sister's mistake and ended up finding the only place I have ever stood where the ground felt like it was actually holding me." She looked at him with the clear, honest eyes of someone who had never needed things decorated to accept them. "Yes, this is where I want to be. You are who I want to be here with." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not gently firmly the way he did everything, the way a man held something he intended to keep. She turned her hand over and held his back. Outside, the wind had finally gone quiet over Red Ridge Ranch, and the eastern fence stood solid against the dark, and the creek ran clean through the land that bore both their names and the life they had not planned but had built together, one hard, honest day at a time, was only just beginning.